Thanks. So welcome everyone to Grassroots Models of Learning for Community Economies. It's really wonderful that you're all able to join us, and I want to say a huge thanks to those who have agreed to share in this session, particularly at this time of year when many of us are screen fatigued and spread across our various commitments and life kind of pools, if you like. So I want to begin by acknowledging country. And in the context that I'm in, it's actually Gundungurra country, which is between Sydney and Canberra. And I want to acknowledge today country, particularly by talking about grass. It seems very fitting to think about grassroots. In this case, what I have come to be calling Tunica grass. And Tunica grass here is actually grown on my home piece of land. And I want to acknowledge that I have learnt about this grass through connecting with a person locally who teaches food sciences in schools, but is also herself studying sustainable development. She recently told me that she is an Indigenous person who has lost her connections in the Australian context with country. And she is finding her way home, connecting with elders, connecting with people who can tell her the stories and who can connect her more with her roots, with her country. This learning exchange with country and with my colleague and friend here, who's a food tech teacher, has also been a learning journey for me, connecting with country and learning about the plants and about the foods and about the people that have cared for this land that I'm living in for thousands of years. So not only do I want to acknowledge the people and the lands that have sustained our planet for thousands of years, but I also want to use this example of Tunica grass to welcome you to this session where we think about the connection between the grassroots learning opportunities and university-based learning opportunities, school-based learning opportunities, and the sort of, if you like, more formal educational institutions and how they connect with the grassroots. You will probably have your own experiences of navigating that, and I'm really hoping that this session will be a rich place of discussion. So in the heading, there's this idea of grassroots models of learning for community economies. Now, I'm not going to detail that too much now, but just to point you, if you wanted to go and have a look at Take Back the Economy, I believe one of its authors, Jenny Cameron, is here with us today. There are some incredible resources in the Community Economies website that we'll talk a little bit about today and that talk about this particular book. But for many of us who work in this space of thinking about community economies, we are talking about a space of ethical negotiation. So we're talking about the survival of our human species alongside other species and environments. We're talking about how we learn from kind of plants like Tunica grass that actually have edible seeds, and how we start to reconnect with all the relationships that sustain us. So if you want to think a little bit more about that, as I said, there are various resources on the Community Economies website that you can go to, and possibly Prior or Catherine can put a link to the Community Economies website up in the chat space. So today we're going to hear from a set of thinkers that are working across this idea of grassroots models of learning and grassroots models of change. So first we're going to hear from colleagues of mine at University of Canberra, David Spillman, Ben Wilson and Catherine McKinnon from University of Canberra. And after their turn of sharing about their experience of grassroots learning, we're going to hear from Amber Seppi. And I think, Kelly, you might be only inputting at this stage into discussion, if you can, around your home commitments today, from Canterbury, New Zealand. And then we're going to switch over to Christoph, who's joining us from Bangalore. and hear about his experience of grassroots learning. And Anka Shwete has kindly made a recording for us today, which I'll be hoping I can play, technology permitting, to you. And then we'll have a quick pause. And then in the last part of the session, we're going to have a little bit of a think about ways in which we can connect between sort of some grassroots learning ideas and current resources and other educational contexts that we're in. So that's where it'll be great to hear from some of you about perhaps experiences that you have across universities and other educational settings. So hopefully I've covered everything in terms of the beginning of the session. I haven't been looking at the chat space, but I see that what's there, I think, is just some great links. Thanks very much, Catherine and Priya. Now, I'm going to ask our speakers to be ready to sort of flow pretty quickly on from one another rather than hearing any more from me. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Amber, just for your knowledge, and I think Christoph, in case I didn't mention it to you, I'm going to tell you when it's 8 minutes is up and you've got 2 minutes left, and then I'll tell you when you're at the end of the 10 minutes. And if you could sort of kind of stick to that, finishing your sentence at 10 minutes, that would be great, so that we've got plenty of time for discussion. So just a reminder to keep your microphones muted while people are speaking, just in case you have interruptions in your own home context. Catherine, have I covered everything? Can you think of anything I've missed? Okay, great. So we're going to move now to Benny and Spilly. Over to you.
I'm just going to share this screen. Just bear with me. How's that, everyone? Can you sort of see the presentation properly here?
We can see it really well. So yeah, whenever you're ready, I'll start your time.
All right, cool. I'm ready now. So thank you, Anne. So thank you very much for having us here today to talk to you. I want to add my own acknowledgement of the places that you're all meeting on, to acknowledge the place of my ancestors, Meanjin in Brisbane in Queensland, and also acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra, where I do my living and my work currently. So we were really excited, my brother, Dave Spillman and I, to sort of talk with you fellas today and to work with Anne Hill through the Centre for Sustainable Communities, because we realised the more we work together, all these overlaps in the work we're doing. My brother and I are particularly interested in Indigenous ways of knowing and embedding those in schooling systems, but we're interested in them because we believe they have utility for the modern world. So it's about sustainability. You know, our way of being is the way of being that's been connected to a sustainable, the most sustainable way of living the world has ever seen. A way of being that has existed for over 60,000 years and possibly much, much longer. So we're very interested in having these conversations around sustainability. So today I'm going to share with you just a little bit about why we do what we do, and then Spilly is going to share how we do what we do. So we were really interested when we started looking at the CERN conference here today about this idea of living together well. And we believe that living together well means accepting some hard truths. And that is that there is a sustainable way of living in this place. And the custodians of this knowledge are still here. But we choose not to do that. We choose not to live sustainably because what we're really obsessed with generally as a society is human comfort. Not human life, although we are, you know, that's always a big thing for us, but it's about not only humans living, but living in a very comfortable way that deprioritize our ecocentric kin, you know, our earth kin. And we're not really interested in that kind of way of living. We think living together well means living together in a sustainable, you know, ecological environment. So you can see that Indigenous content and the way that we frame Indigenous ways of knowing within the Australian curriculum has been entwined within the discourse of reconciliation. And there's been some negative outcomes for that, because the reconciliation movement transitions our identity as Indigenous people, which primarily through the teaching of our grandfathers, grandmothers, has always been about being connected and profoundly part of place, an ecocentric idea, to this sort of state-sanctioned indigeneity, which is sort of repressed, appropriated, and disarticulated from Indigenous collectives. It's turned us an ecocentric way of being pre-colonization into a profoundly anthropocentric way of being post-colonization, and that doesn't sit with us very well. So as you can see, the current approach in the Australian education system is to dissect and decontextualize bodies of Indigenous knowledge, and then take little portions of that and put that Indigenous content into, you know, a history curriculum or a science curriculum or an English curriculum, and exotify what's going on there and say, isn't this interesting that we have Indigenous perspectives in our work now? Anyway, the real stuff we want to talk to you about is over here. That's not good enough for the work that me and Spilly, it's not good enough for our ways. That's mine and Spilly's belief. So in education at the moment in Australia, and this is pretty well documented, current approaches prioritize competition and material wealth over sustainable practices. To put it simply, there's an endless growth paradigm that sort of pervades everything we do in education. What we are really interested in is how we can all learn to know, understand, and care for our country, and thus enact Indigenous ways of being. So it's moving beyond the rhetoric of, oh, isn't this an interesting, exotic little thing, Indigenous ways of knowing, to understanding that Indigenous ways of knowing, and particularly the way that we built sustainable societies for thousands and thousands of years, has value and has utility for modern education systems. Our old people, mine and Spilly's old people, have trusted us with their knowledge and processes to challenge and strengthen these educational norms. And that's largely the thrust of the work that we do at the University of Canberra. And again, I want to acknowledge Catherine McKinnon and the Centre for Sustainable Communities who support us in that work in a very profound way, and the Faculty of Education, of course. So how do we do this? Spilly is going to talk about the nuts and bolts in a moment, but basically at UC, where we do our work, our approach to education is built on the central ethic of knowing, understanding, and caring for country. So it's important to note that what we do isn't about completely replacing current approaches, because there's good stuff in there. Student-centric learning, for example, is anthropocentric, but there's really good stuff in student-centric learning. But it argues for a critical rebalancing. We have anthropocentric ideals and ideology that is heavily, heavily favored over ecocentric ideology. And so we're asking for a rebalancing of the way that we do things in the education system. The way that we do this, through the knowledge of our grandfathers, and in particular done with Paul Gordon, and Spilly's going to talk about some of his theoretical and pedagogical frameworks in a moment. It's about having direct lived experiences on country. So we do this in our work with our students at a master's level and an undergraduate level, and also through various grants that we have with various funding bodies. Through ACT government schools and wider parts of the ACT community. We're giving them direct lived experiences on country to develop students' ecological and social capacities in line with the 6 L's learning framework, which Spilly's going to talk about shortly. So in this way, what we have and what we aim for in our work is not to have the exotified, oh, isn't this really interesting little Indigenous stuff? We have all stakeholders in learning institutions enacting Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing for cultural renewal and for ecological renewal. That's the stuff that we're really interested in, and we think that Indigenous ways of knowing have a really strong motor to get us there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Spilly, who's going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how we do, of our approach in education. So over to you, my brother.
Yeah, my bro, thank you for that. It's probably not the nuts and bolts. It's probably just the some of the overarching frameworks, I guess, depending on what you mean by nuts and bolts. And I might read what I've written just for brevity because of time, or I'll refer to it anyway. So teaching and learning to ensure sustainable and largely, though not entirely local, ecologies and economies has been happening in Australia for at least 60,000 years. And it's likely in the coming years, next few years, that might be doubled, pushed out to 120,000 years. Due to some archaeological work going on at the moment. So for the majority of that time that we've been here, except for the last couple 100 years, our primary teacher has always been country, our earthkin, not humans. Humans largely, or most often in the form of grandparents, grandfathers for grandsons and grandmothers for granddaughters, can introduce us to a body of law or a body of knowledge by telling us probably what's the most superficial aspect of that body of law or knowledge. And we can only access the deeper body in its entirety through extended periods of time on country, learning from the earthkin whose story is part of that, whose story is part of that law.
You have 2 minutes left, Billy.
Yeah, thank you. The 6 L's here is an example of cultural continuity. So we've been handed this knowledge because we've demonstrated the capacity to hold it and to live it, and we've been given permission to share it because of that. So this is from Damo Paul Gordon, our grandfather, who's taught us. So law is the body of knowledge for any particular earthkin, and law for country is the accumulation of all those bodies of knowledge together. When somebody introduces us to part of the law for, say, a crimson rosella or a red gum or a place, it often creates curiosity and affective response, and certainly does in kids. So that's represented by love. So we get a little bit of a story and we have an affective response. It might be a desire, a motivation, a curiosity. And then what this whole pedagogical process is about getting on country and spending time looking, listening and learning. And the more we learn, the more law we accumulate. The more law we accumulate, the deeper our affective response becomes. Eventually we come to love our place and really deeply want to care for it. And then we're ready to lead. Last slide, bros. So through this teaching and learning process, we developed a balanced array of ways of knowing, being and doing, encapsulated in this drawing that I've drawn with permission from Paul Gordon, the grandfather. We've seen this these symbols carved into the body of a bush turkey at Wollombi on a rock that's been carbon dated to 27,000 years. So this is a pretty old story. And you can see here there are 4 centers of consciousness or of ways of knowing, being and doing in the guana. So for the guana to be well, all 4 centers need to be operating and in balance. The tail is a transgenerational knowledge that's passed intergenerationally. The stuff that we've been getting from our grandfather. The gut is the metabolic furnace of the guga, so it's the embodied learning through our bodies, learning through doing, but it also represents intuitive gut knowing. The heart is the affective learning that's represented by law and the 6 L's, and of course then there's the head, which is the analytical logical learning. It's the tail, not the head, that directs the guga. And you can see there, the last thing I'll say, you can see there that the analytical, logical ways of knowing, being, doing, represented by head, are cut off from Mother Earth. So if you follow the spaces in the claws up from the ground, you can get into the heart, the gut, the tail, but you can't enter the head. And our old people always tell us that if we try to understand the world or our life with our head, we are doomed to failure. And they'll probably leave it there. If that's all right.
Thank you so much for sharing, Benny and Spilly. Lots of food for thought. Amber, are you ready? Over to you.
I need that screen share to stop before I can share mine.
So that's you, Benny. Just have to stop sharing your screen.
I'm sorry, can someone give me help? I've only got the opportunity to share. I don't have stop sharing.
So have you got a little button that says stop sharing, a little red button somewhere on your screen?
I don't believe so. Hang on a second.
It says Ben Wilson's screen.
Here we go. Yeah, I had to share and then not share. Apologies, Amber. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Right, can everyone see that?
We can.
Right. I'll just minimize the stuff at the side so I can read these slides. All right. Kia ora koutou katoa. I am speaking on behalf of myself and Kelly Dombrowski, who is there somewhere in the in the background and has supported this teaching model, which dovetails really nicely, I think, with what we've just heard. So thank you for that. So I'm coming to you from Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm affiliated with the University of Canterbury Geography Department, which is in the College of Science. So what we've done in the last semester, just coming to a close now, is a trial of something called applied kaitiakitanga, which is a term for stewardship, similar to what was just outlined with the relationships with country. What I really wanted to do here was to see if a class of students could go through a model that was somewhat structured to bring them into closer relationship. And we called this a more than human community partnership. So I'll go through the nuts and bolts first. We had 38 students at 200 level or second year, and this was a transformational teaching strategy. So the objective was specifically decolonizing to build a relationship with what they would be used to in a science curriculum referring to as nature. The lectures first up were focused on a sentient earth ethic. Sentient earth ethic comes out of my own research. It's not a term that I could find an equivalent for, but basically it refers to the ethic found across time and geographies within traditional and Indigenous earth-oriented communities. And the disclaimer here is that not all traditional and Indigenous communities are earth-oriented, and there are, of course, earth-oriented communities that don't fit too well to these particular terms. So the principles of the sentient earth ethic were part of the curriculum, and the teaching content included the basic philosophy and metaphysics, such as cosmology and axiology, so values and worldview, which support this ethic, nature connection principles, more than human connection principles, conduct, strategies, examples, and case studies. These conversations were then directed towards a structured more than human community partnership. So here, this is known as becoming kaitiaki. So this is a term for guardianship or stewardship that's extended to another species, place, or collective. So it's making kin of a non-human or more than human or other than human, and building that relationship. So could be a species, place, collective, estuary, plant, animal, insect, soil, community, river, etc. And the students that came into this class needed to choose who they would create this relationship with. So a couple of basics on the sentient earth ethics. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I have put quite a bit of these principles in print, which I'm happy to pass along. Basically, there are versions of this found cross-culturally, and I'm of the opinion that the state that we are collectively in, whether we are Indigenous, claim a traditional heritage or not, come from not recognizing an earth ethic that really is the time-tested way to thrive. So relationship, respect, responsibility, reverence, so acknowledging the unseen, reciprocity, regeneration, or a deference to cycles, and redistribution or a sharing ethic, which is of course the opposite of our usual property-based economic capitalistic way of being. One nice way to think of this is making ropes. This has been offered from CERN communities in Southern Africa to refer to how relationships are built, how connections are maintained. They're woven together over a period of time. And of course, for many of us, not being born into a community in which this is cultivated, we're doing this anew. So in this particular learning environment, the basic assumption was that everyone that came into this project did not have the tools that had been handed along as to how to build these relationships. Other aspects of the sentient earth ethic, laws, payments, treaties, protocols, rules of engagement, again, found cross-culturally. I've mapped these across all continents through time and geography in one form or another, though the symbolic architecture is, of course, different and specific to places. But again, these principles are all really pointing to a way of being on Earth that is consistently found as workable and sustainable, and accepts a seen and unseen aspect to reality. So is reliant on intuitive capacities, communication with spirit ancestors, etc. Or in shorthand, we are inside the consciousness of Earth rather than consciousness is only inside of us. A few more basic principles. Identity is conferred upon us by places, where we are right now, who we are with, other species and humans in place. Identity is not by blood kinship alone or ancestral affiliation. It's primarily human, and human responsibilities of guardianship and stewardship transcend blood kin affiliations and historical origins. I'm not saying here that identity is not important. What I'm saying is that there is a broader identity which is recognised by traditional and Indigenous communities as transcending the specifics of identity conferred in specific places. Something from a local tohanga, now an ancestor, Hohepa Kiriopa. A good principle for the students was knowing that something can be done is far more important than knowing exactly how to do it. So we can innovate and work with our direct relationship to Earth and the invisible, taking guidance directly. Further principles, there are differences between cultural complexes across time and geographies. But outside of the symbolic architecture, all Earth-oriented communities do recognise kin elsewhere and a similarity of these value structures. So when we read over and over again of these continuities between, say, Indigenous elders speaking across geographies to each other and saying, I am like you, what we're trying to get at here is that there's an understanding that seems to have been lost on academics, to be blunt, with regard to what that continuity actually is. And a lot of scholarship looks at different symbolic architecture and says, well, these are different distinct identities. Yes, they are, but the continuity is in the ethic. So the specifics of the symbolic architecture, meaning ritual, traditions, processes, and language of a place and people is not relevant unless it is relevant to you, forms a part of your own tradition or identification lines. And you avoid appropriation by respecting the specificity of such symbolic architectural features.
1.5 minutes left, sorry.
It's all right, it's a little bit more. So it's don't mistake the architecture for the objective. All humans have a service role, and the invitation from elders and leaders is for displaced humans to apprentice to the ethic according to talents, skills, and passions. So we'll whiz along. This is the project that we engaged in. Basics of this, which will be on the slides to share afterwards, but they went through a structured inquiry looking at knowledge from a conventional perspective, so looking scientifically at their partner, but then looking at local folk, Indigenous, spiritual or story-based views. Then they came up with a creative expression, so video, audio, artistic or similar, and finally a presentation which narrated their whole experience over the 8 weeks. So they were learning, watching, spending time with their partner and building on this relationship with an aim for permanent transformation through these multiple forms of engagement. This is the last slide. The overall outcome of this was fantastic. The students noted positive mental health outcomes. I will definitely be continuing this relationship with my partner. I did not understand what I was doing to begin with, but once I I spent the time, I saw the benefit. This kind of feedback absolutely blew me away. It was transformational for worldview. All 38 of the students did exceptionally well. They engaged fully in the process and allowed it to work on them to build these relationships. The going from, is this even possible, to feeling a deep affinity. I particularly like, I won't read them all out, but I particularly like the reflection in the far right here. The assignment is one of a kind. When you tell people about it, you most likely get a confused face and a laugh. Your 50% assignment is making friends with a rose bush. But as she goes on to say, and I am done, this process has allowed them to approach it from what we would call a Western model, how we normally learn, and then push through to actually make the necessary connections. So overall, really, really successful. Thank you very much. I hope that all came across all right, and I will share those slides so that you can see them. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Amber. And what rich connection between those first two reflections of grassroots learning models. Thank you so much. Christoph, we're going to move to you. And Christoph actually presented in the Community Economies Research Network prior, and one of the questions that came up was how to link some of his work to more than human sensibilities. So it's a really great flow on and something we can come back to in the discussion. So over to you, Christoph.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that too. Thanks, Anne, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. So I am working with Project DEFY, DEFY an acronym which stands for Design Education for Yourself, which is a non-profit organization based in Bangalore, India, started in 2016. Most of our learning spaces are in India, but also have spread now to Bangladesh and several African countries. The origin for this model or for our work was basically the idea of how can we help people access individually relevant, decentralized and meaningful education, particularly for the ones who are more marginalized, because especially in the Indian context, we can see very, very extreme how really the access to the type of school and quality of school is very much linked to one's socioeconomic background, caste, class, and so on. But also it stems from an overall critique of the modern education system, particularly the schooling system, which is more or less imparting abstract and theoretical knowledge for people to fit into the dominant system, into capitalist society, basically, and gives people or just prepares people to fulfill their pre-assigned roles, but it doesn't really help us to discover our own skills, passions, and to do something around that. So the main question for us really was, how can education enable us to be in charge of our own lives? How can education be an enabler to take control of our own lives and pursue our own ideas of what makes meaningful lives, and not basically what others tell us would be meaningful lives that we should lead. And born out of that was the approach of the what we call the Nuke model of self-designed learning. So Nuke, N-O-O-K, comes from the Hindi word nukat, which is basically a place at the corner of the street where people used to meet and chat and interact with each other, talk to each other, discuss what's going on in their community, and so on. And previously in India, you had a lot of those meeting spaces, community spaces, but unfortunately also here they have disappeared over time. And I think this word nukat and Nuke, what we made out of it, then also shows that we don't only want to create a learning space, but also a community space, a meeting space, basically. So combining both learning, but also more than just everyone coming there, doing their own projects. It's much more about coming together, growing as a community, learning from each other, learning with each other, and so on. And self-designed learning basically is, yeah, you can say learner-led approach, not only learner-centric, but learner-led approach, where really each and every learner is in charge of what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, and what they want to do with whatever they learn. An important part here is also the idea of learning how to learn. So basically making our learners less dependent on teachers, on textbooks, and so on. Because, and we've seen that, I think, in the pandemic, people just thought that once school or college was closed, learning automatically stops. Like you're always dependent on a teacher, you're always dependent on some figure of authority who tells you what to do. And so we are trying to really integrate that idea of learning how to learn in our spaces, which basically means broadening the idea of our learners of what actually is valuable learning, what can you learn, and what kind of knowledge sources are out there. So broadening the idea of what is a valuable knowledge source away from that sort of Western canon, and integrating a lot of other knowledges, from community-based knowledge to layman knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and so on. So let me just tell you a little bit about what does a Nuke actually look like. So you can imagine them basically as physical spaces of around 1,000 to 1,500 square feet in a local community, mostly located in the center of those communities. They are equipped with laptops, tools, electronics, technology, recycled materials, and a lot of resources which are there and which are free to use for all the learners who are coming there. So we're working mostly with marginalized youth, 15 to 25 years old, but in general, everyone can come. So we are not restricting the age. We're saying, okay, you should be above maybe 10 or 12 years old, because we have a lot of tools and electronics and so on to use. So for it also to make sense, you might have to have a certain minimum age, but then we have learners really who are 12 years, who are 20 years, who are 40, 50, 60 plus years old, and they work together in small groups of 2 to 4 people. So also a lot of intergenerational learning is happening, which you usually don't see much in the arena of mainstream education. Now, how does the model work? I just want to talk quickly about that to give you an idea. So we start we have batches of new learners, which would be like 30 to 40 people in one batch. And we start with what we call an induction program, which is around 2 months long, which is mostly about deconditioning the schooled mindset. Now, what we mean by that is basically most of our learners, they have gone through the mainstream education system, and especially in the case of India, they are very much conditioned, like I also said before, according to their caste and class background. So if you come from that particular community, if your parents have this particular job, then the best you can expect is probably to do exactly the same. And there's also a lot of social taboos at times of what people from certain backgrounds and so on could do. So we are trying to start breaking this schooled mindset. And how we do that is basically giving learners concrete experience of possibility or potentiality. So introducing them to a lot of hands-on projects which we do together that usually they wouldn't do or they wouldn't be expected to do, which can be really anything from, let's say, doing a 3D design or coding, programming, web design, to urban farming, carpentry, metalwork. So we're trying to be as broad as possible within 2 months and going through a range of very different experiences, also experiences that that sort of break that gender stereotyping. So if we do tailoring, then for instance, also all the boys and men would do some tailoring project. If we do metalworks, also all the girls and women would do metalworks and so on. And at the end of the induction program, what we're then doing is a process called goal setting. Goal setting process, we introduce principles such as ikigai. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. It's a Japanese principle which basically helps
1.5 minutes left, Christoph, sorry.
No worries. Which basically helps you to find what are you good at, what are you interested in, or what do you like to do, what can sustain you, and what is good for the planet. And the common denominator of all of this would be your ikigai. So we introduce principles like this, and then we help the learners to set a goal for the next 3 months, and a relevant goal for themselves, which they will pursue in our learning spaces for the next 3 months, using all the resources we have, using the support we have, using outside mentors, external sources, and so on. And then over the next 3 months, we have the goal cycle running, where we are the learners in small groups of, say, 2 to 4 people mostly, pursue their goals. And we have a facilitator in the Nuke who helps them to check on, have I reached the milestones for my goals? Am I on track? Who helps them to identify learning sources, and yeah, keeps them hopefully and mostly on track. And yeah, that is basically how the Nuke model of self-designed learning works. We have now, I think, around 12 or 13 Nukes, like I said, across South Asia and Africa. And yeah, so still a very young organization, but that's why we are also very interested in tying up with people in the academic world who are looking into research of grassroots models of learning, who would also be interested to do some research about our model and how we can refine and improve it and tie in with community economies. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And lots of food for thought. So I'm just going to share Anka's presentation, and just bear with me for a moment while I also paste the link in the chat space in case you have trouble following. Okay, so meanwhile, there's a loud crow outside my window, which is very nice to hear. It's not coming up. Here we go. Catherine, can you just tell me in a moment that you can hear this okay, and I'll make it full screen.
Hello, my name is Anka Shvetai. I'm a professor of anthropology and global development.
All good? Okay, thanks.
And at the University of Sussex in the UK. And first of all, I would like to thank Anne for inviting me to participate in this really interesting panel. Now, I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person. I think technology has given us the amazing ability to have online conferences like this and online networks like CERN, but it hasn't quite offered a solution to the time zone challenge, the time zone difference between Australia and the UK yet. So I've pre-recorded my talk. And in my talk, I'm going to look at the potential of creative teaching and learning to blur the boundaries between higher and grassroots education, specifically in the context of using a diverse economies approach. And this talk is based on a book I recently published called Creative Universities, Reimagining Education for Global Challenges and Alternative Futures with Bristol University Press. I'm quickly going to share my screen for the remainder of my presentation. So at the heart of the book is what I call a critical creative pedagogy. And I think this pedagogy has a lot of potential to speak to diverse educational contexts. It consists of 4 strands. The first strand is whole person learning. And whole person learning really invites learners to bring not only their intellects, but also their bodies, their emotions, their senses, and especially their experiences into the classroom. And I think that might even be easier in kind of informal educational settings where people might feel more comfortable to kind of participate in a holistic way. Often that can be quite imitating in kind of institutional university classrooms. The second strand are design and arts methods. And I explore their potential to really open up learners' imagination, to be comfortable with ambiguity, to develop creative capacities, as well as empathy, again, in a diversity of educational settings. The third strand of critical creative pedagogy is praxis, from Freire's idea of practice that is informed by theory, by reflection, and by dialogue. And for me, praxis spans kind of the inside and the outside of classrooms. Again, because of this boundary crossing, I think it can be applied, and it is applicable to a wide variety of learning contexts. And then last but not least is critical hope. And for me, critical hope refers to teachers encouraging learners to either be hopeful or stay hopeful, or to become more hopeful. And I think it does take a lot of courage to be hopeful in this day and age. It's not a kind of a naive or wishful thinking kind of hope, but for me, critical hope is active, it's recreative, it addresses past injustices and current inequalities. And hope is forward-looking, right? Hope is really the way in which we take learning outside of the classroom and again, apply it for transformative action. So hopefully from this really short summary of my critical creative, the potential of it to bring together institutional and grassroots learning environments. And what I want to do now is look at a specific teaching activity, the creation of personal diverse economy portfolios, and again, see what the potential here lies to get learners in really different settings to think about their economic lives in alternative, very open ways. And I frame this activity through a shift from the paralyzing question of what is to be done to what is already being done. And this is a quote by Gibson Graham. And the focus here really is what is already being done by students in their economic lives. So it's the departure point is experiential teaching. This activity consists of 4 different components: a diary, an inventory, questions, and creative representation. And the diary, the first step is really asking learners to keep a diary of all of their economic transactions and interactions and exchanges for a week, to become much more conscious of it, to become more aware of it, and to write it down. So, where did they go? Who did they interact with? Was money exchanged? What was the purpose of the interaction? And then once this diary is established, they are starting to kind of categorize their interactions according to capitalist or alto-capitalist or non-capitalist. And that then leads into the second component of the exercise, which is to establish an inventory. And here I have gone to the diverse economies framework for a template that I found really helpful in terms of asking students, and that's kind of the critical analytical part of the exercise, to think about their transactional exchanges, the economic organizations they're engaging with, and then their own labor practices and to start to tease them apart into, again, capitalist or alter-capitalist or non-market, non-capitalist or unpaid. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can see that there's kind of a real opening up to thinking about economic practices according to these different categories. Now, the third step of the activity is really, really important in terms of bringing in the ethical dimension of economic lives. And here we ask learners to pose two questions. The first one is, on what basis am I making economic decisions? And I think when learners ask themselves this, they will realize that it's probably a kind of a wide variety of criteria that they take into account in their economic lives. So it could be affordability and convenience, but there might well be ethical decisions around, the treatment of other human beings through fair trade, or animal rights, or food miles to address kind of ecological concerns. And by making these reasonings, these thought processes visible, students are realizing themselves as most students, I think, will realize themselves as kind of ethical economic actors and start to decenter these neoclassical approaches of economic subjects as self-centered rational decision makers. And that's continued in the second part of the of this step with the question: what kinds of social relationships am I entering or creating through my economic activities? And here really the emphasis is on understanding who learners are connecting with through their economic lives. So it could, of course, be kind of, standard capitalist relations at the supermarket. It could also be kin relations, parent-children's relation, or kind of mentors, neighbors, flatmates, other students. So again, really becoming aware of the variety of different social relationships that learners are establishing or entering through their economic activities. And what this makes visible is that economies are socially embedded, right? That they're an integral part of society and social life, rather than being a domain that sits apart from it. Now, the final step, and that's really important when we think about creative learning and teaching, is to make a creative representation of this portfolio. And of course, I think the most obvious one, the one that you're probably all familiar with, is for learners to draw their own iceberg. It's a pedagogical tool developed by Gibson Graham and colleagues that shows that what is often assumed to be the economy is really kind of the tip of a vast iceberg of economic relations and interactions and transactions. And most of them are invisible, but are making up the bulk of people's economic lives. And it is really about kind of decentering what Gibson Graham called capitalist-centric discourses and practices. So the iceberg is kind of one possibility. We could also ask learners to think about more multimedia outputs, right? Videos, podcasts, formats that a lot of learners are very familiar and comfortable with. And the point of this step is to decenter writing. And in my book, I talk a lot about the importance of moving away from writing in order to get to kind of more creative ways of expressing ourselves. And in this case, for students to imagine and express themselves as ethical economic subjects in more creative ways. So this was a really brief summary of critical creative pedagogy, as well as this specific teaching exercise. But I hope that it was enough to show you where the potential of creative education and of diverse and community economies approach to economic teaching, where the potential lies to blur the boundaries between grassroots and institutional education environments, and how it might be applicable in a variety of educational settings. So thank you so much for listening today. Please do get in touch with questions or comments. There's my email, I'm on Twitter, and there's also, in addition to the book, companion website, creativeuniversities.com, where I have a regular blog I share teaching resources and interviews with lots of educators. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
I'm very much hoping to have Anka come to visit University of Canberra. So for those of you that are in our part of the world, you may have a chance to interact with her a bit more. So I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes pause. It was going to be 5 minutes, but I'm going to cut it a bit short. So we're just going to take a 2-minute silence kind of mull time, just to give us time to synthesize and perhaps think about what we might want to ask in the questions, what we might want to raise for discussion. So I'll just put a 2-minute timer on. Perhaps you can do the same if you're going to walk away from your screen, and we'll be back here in 2 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'll just give everyone a moment to feel free to turn on your cameras at this point so we can engage with you if you have the internet connection to do so. So I'm just having a look at the chat space. No problem, eating lunch, fully understand that. And I see there's a message there from Jenny. I'll just pull the chat up. So if anyone would like to use their microphone to share some reflections, feel free. I'm just having a look at what you're saying there, Jenny. Could we hear a bit more from David and Ben about how their principles translate into classroom broadly defined? Have a sense of this from the others, but not from David and Ben. Just thought it might help with the discussion. So that's a great reflection. And yeah, I guess, I don't know whether you want to respond to that straight away.
No, you go, Anne, keep going. I didn't mean to catch.
Okay, I just wanted to add to that one of the things that I was thinking about as you all spoke was the way in which you all had kind of something to say about relationships being reconfigured between humans and others. And so Benny and Spilly started off by talking about this idea of an ecocentric as opposed to anthropocentric perspective, and you know, very much, I know, advocating for that ecocentric perspective, which comes up against human, you know, learning, where so much of our school-based systems, so much of our education systems is very human-centric and very individual-centric. Whereas, you know, so there's that. And I think when Amber was talking, we were hearing about this sense of kind of beautiful partnership emerging between the human and their chosen other who was non-human, you know, and actually having this incredible relationship of developing that sense of connection. So the way you described that, Amber, was so lovely, you know, and having this earth ethic, a time-tested way to thrive. And I think, Christoph, your model is also very much a collective one, where learners are learning how to learn alongside each other in the Nuke, the Nook, but it's still very much focusing, I think, with the human. So I think one of the things that where we just began to discuss in previous conversations was how that might be more informed by the more than human kind of material sort of world. And then lastly, I think Anka actually came back to that idea of the importance of sociality and relationships. And I think for her as well, there's an interest in kind of trying to push further into the ecological aspects of relationships potentially, although I'd like to talk to her more about that. Thank you, Margie, for your note. It was great to have you here. So anyway, I don't know whether that touches on what Jenny's saying, but it would be great to hear your thoughts, Benny and Spilly, on Jenny's comment there about how the principles translate into the classroom, but maybe also to think a bit more about this idea of how humans are kind of rethought, you know, the relationship between the human and others is being rethought. And then there's also a comment from Kelly, add a bit more about Amber's work in connection with wider university and pedagogical shifts. Great. So how about we go to Benny and Spilly first, if you want to add anything in response to Jenny's comment or my comment, and then anyone else if you want to add in, and then we'll come to you, Kelly.
You go, brother. You were about to say something. Okay. From the muted Dave Spillman, I think that he was indicating he wanted me to talk. Look, I was looking in the chat and I can't actually see the question for some reason. But if I'm correct, it's about how what we do translates into primary and secondary classrooms. Is that right?
I think it's classroom broadly defined. So it could be, you know, that country is a classroom too, but it's more maybe just a little bit more of the specifics of how it actually works, possibly. And Jenny, feel free to jump in and correct if you'd like to, if I've not got that right. Maybe just the actual nuts and bolts of how it actually happens, you know, where some of the other speakers have talked a bit more about the specificities of what they do.
Well, look, it was, oh, sorry,
right,
Jenny, you go.
Yes. Sorry, I'm partway through cooking dinner, so I'm listening and cooking. Yes, classroom broadly defined, and just, yeah, as Anne said, some of the nuts and bolts about how this translates into learning situations.
Yeah, sure. So you might have seen when Amber was presenting on her work, Spilly and I nodding along and getting very excited. And though we didn't talk about it, we certainly didn't know what Amber was presenting. That kind of thing is largely what we're trying to do at the University of Canberra, and also what's going on in classrooms. So it starts off with giving students direct experiences of country as teacher. And so what that means for us is getting them outside, getting them to learn the stories of their local places, the places they inhabit. We use journaling to get them to keep, their idea of experiences as they go forward. as Amber spoke about, and I really liked it as well, I could tell Spilly did, you know, can you believe, you know, what do you mean your assessment is to make friends with a rose bush? Well, that's kind of the stuff that we talk about as well. We ask people to spend time on country in a particular discrete place. And when they've spent time there, to sort of open themselves up through, you know, meditative processes to these, you know, to earthkin, and to ask themselves what country is trying to teach them, or what their earthkin are trying to teach them. And we have assessment sort of based upon that, you know, that's got to do with self-reflexive transformative learning. We're getting people to sort of reflect, well, this is who I thought I was going to be as a teacher, because we're in teacher education. And this is, you know, how I'm going to incorporate these ecocentric processes into my future teaching practice. So does that answer your question, Jenny? Or was that a bit waffly? Sorry, I know you're cooking dinner as well. I probably got you when you've got 2 pots in your hand or something. So while I'm waiting for Jenny though, brother, are you still there? And did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I guess it's just that as being both teachers, I still see myself as a classroom school teacher more than anything, I suppose. We recognise that if teachers in schools are going to be able to offer or facilitate opportunities for students to connect with and learn from country, then teachers themselves have to have that direct experience. So they have to go through that transformative process themselves before they've got any chance of really being able to create opportunities for students to have those experiences. So there's the work we do in the undergraduate and postgraduate level teaching, but we're also undertaking a country's teacher research project through the Centre for Sustainable Communities, where we're working with teachers from 4 schools in the ACT. And the first phase of that has been them spending a term going out on country by themselves. And in a way, attempting to find a partner, as Amber talked about, not explicitly like that, but nevertheless, that's kind of what happened. And then going through the struggle, I guess it's a decolonizing struggle of getting out of my head, stopping the stream of thought, or allowing the stream of thought to cease so that I can access those other aspects of Guga, where I can really connect and know in different ways. So there's a lot of synergies between what Amber presented and the experiences our research participants and university students are having. Catherine?
Yeah, I didn't really have anything to add to that. In terms of the nitty-gritty, I was really struck by the comments, Amber, that you show on that last slide. They're just so similar, the feeling and the content so similar to what we're hearing back from the teachers who are participating in that research project with those 4 schools, you know, stories, you know, wonderful stories about just developing a real sense of kinship with a tree, you know, for example, and people being really ready to do that, surprisingly ready and able to do that, just needing to be given a prompt and a nudge and an opportunity to kind of remember and recognize their kinship. That's what it feels like watching that process unfold.
Do you want to add anything, Amber?
Only fantastic. It sounds like what you're doing is awesome, and I'm really struck by the fact that there's this parallel happening, because I'm aware of similar initiatives in Canada and the US and various other corners of the world, Devon in the UK. Seems like there's like a, as you just said, Catherine, a willingness to now be able to jump over that rationale resistance. No, I'm delighted. It'd be really nice to bring some of these conversations into a kind of accessible curriculum resource and then just distribute them everywhere. There's willingness for that.
Fantastic. And when we hear from Prior in a little while, we might have an opportunity to talk more about how we might bring some of these ideas and resources together for sort of sharing collectively. Christoph, one thing that makes me think about a link to your work is that there's a lot of sort of resonance in people learning by connecting with material, material worlds. And so for some of us, it's that connection with, say, country or landscape or plants and trees is a really rich connection with something living. But there's also a lot of research that shows, we can learn to be affected by our material connections. And I think of when I was writing my PhD, I was talking about how human hands learn to work with bamboo in design, and actually by feeling the material and feeling the bend and the sway of that material, they can form a new relationship with the material itself. And in the Philippines, I've done work, say, in people's connections with waste materials and how they rethink themselves as part of, a world where material really matters. And I'm sure prior you would have a lot of resonance with that from your work in terms of people's relationships with materials in informal mining and so on. So Heather, I think you've done, correct me if I'm wrong, some work in the arts space where you think a little bit about people's connection with materials. Is that right? Have I got that right?
There's a coal train going by. It's really loud. Oh my house. No, I don't. I work with cabaret, so that's a train. That's Alberta Coal. Yeah, I work for cabaret, like drag, like performance.
Okay.
But a lot of yeah, where I'm working right now in the interior of so-called British Columbia, there's incredible Indigenous-led research centers at this university I'm working with, and place-based and land-based learning is totally where my Indigenous colleagues are taking us all. So this is amazing. So, but I think through like community theater and performance. So that's the material, is people's sense of humor.
Right. I'm sorry I got that wrong. I was thinking arts-based practice, but I
could. Yeah, people making beards out of random cotton balls and stuff. So yeah, whatever you got, making characters. So
yeah.
There's bodies in that too, I think, which is the other materiality of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so Christoph, did you want to add anything in terms of joining the dots to what the other presenters have been saying in terms of reconfiguring relationships?
I mean, in our case, so what I keep on thinking, and you mentioned this as well, is like, how do we get more into those aspects of human nature relationships and sustainability and so on in learning spaces, which are mostly dealing, or not dealing, but rather mostly frequented by members from marginalized communities. Like what I was thinking, hearing from the other examples is that I mean, I would love for our learners to have such experiences and reconnecting with nature and all that. But right now, what I see, especially in India, it's hard enough to convince people to come to our space and not spend all their time in schools and tuition places and so on, to because we don't give them a degree, we don't give them a certificate, and this mindset is really much there, and people are very much concerned in terms of thinking, okay, how do I make ends meet on a weekly, on a monthly basis? And so to integrate those aspects. So most people come to us eventually, they want to do a project. Okay, how do I earn an income, right? That is very important for them. So obviously, like I said, we have those principles of Ikigai, which we try to introduce. We also put some focus in terms of, okay, you should obviously not do any project that would harm nature or anything like that. It should be something ideally that something that is positive for society, that is good for the planet, and so on. But it's very hard to get to that point, and it's I think it's very difficult to think beyond humans and materialistic needs and so on, in the space of marginalized communities, and to, you know, make them interested in that. I'm sure if that happens, it would be very worthwhile for them, but getting there, I think, is the difficult part for us. We do have a very interesting partnership that is coming up now, a new learning center next year in Chennai, which we are doing together with the Indo-German Center for Sustainability, which is a think tank specifically focusing on issues of sustainability. So we hope this also gives us some ideas of what kind of projects could we do that transcend that what we have right now, and go more towards sustainable projects and understanding land, understanding nature, your local surroundings, and so on. So very excited how this pans out. But in the meantime, yeah, I think this is really a big challenge for us to sort of, you know, on the one side you have the concrete daily needs of people, and on the other side you need some time to you know, establish your relations with nature, understand your land, your community, and so on. So how to balance this out, I guess, is one challenge that we have, where maybe it would be interesting to hear. From
yeah, there was a question for you in the chat space, Christoph, and I'm conscious that Kelly wanted to add to Amber's presentation. I was just giving everyone a chance to kind of come to this idea that Jenny began with. So Christoph, do you want to respond to Amber's comment there of, can you tell us a bit more about how to teach the art of learning to learn? And then we'll go to you, Kelly, to hear your comments from way up in the chat space.
Sure. Probably teaching is the wrong word. So I guess like a lot or most of what we're doing, it comes with this experience, right? To see, first of all, that is what I said when we do the induction program and we do this kind of deconditioning. So to give them an experience that, hey, there are also other ways of how I can learn things, right? And people often don't realize this. First, you will be lost if you don't have your authority figure or your written book or whatsoever. What do I do, right? But to sort of make people think, okay, what would be other ways of how I can learn? So how we do this, for instance, is when people set their goals for 3 months, we help them to break them down into concrete milestones. So say I have a 3 months goal, and then for each week of those 3 months, I set myself one concrete milestone. I'll break down that goal into all those milestones, and then I look into how do I reach every milestone. So there we identify different learning sources, and what we put special emphasis is that throughout those 3 months and throughout those milestones the learners are trying to achieve, they draw on a variety of learning sources. So we are explicitly looking at okay, not for say like, so for 3 weeks we would have 12 milestones, which means you should not have for every single milestone a learning source. I'm watching this YouTube video, I'm using this open online course. You should have also something like, I'm going out into the local community and do some research. I'm trying to find a mentor either from the local community or from outside to learn something like this. I am finding out among the other learners who know something about this, and I have a conversation with them. And to really make sure that, okay, we have a broad variety of knowledge sources for our milestones, and that sort of gives people the idea then also for later on, hey, if I learned this one goal through all those different sources, next time if I want to learn something, maybe I can also try to find and identify my own learning. So it's more about raising or like making people aware that there are actually much more learning sources and potential learning sources and resources out there, than we might think, because we're so conditioned by school to only think only that authoritative figure or that source and so on is a learning source.
It sounds much more like a self-directed mode of learning.
Yeah, correct.
Thank you. So Kelly, I'm looking at the chat space there, and I'd love to add a bit more about Amber's work in connection with wider university and pedagogical shifts, which might allow for some of us to join the dots with what Anka was saying as well. So it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. Kia ora, everyone. And thank you for all your great talks. I really feeling quite excited about teaching, even though we're at the end of the teaching year. So I was just wanting to provide some context for how we came about doing including Amber's course in the geography curriculum, and what it was part of the wider moves in governance at the University of Canterbury, Te Whare Wānanga or Waitaha. And one of the recent, very recent, just in the last few months, is that the local hapu of the iwi Ngaitahu now has a co-governance role with the Vice-Chancellor. So there's a position that's been created that's basically a kind of co-Vice-Chancellor Māori, who is also the traditional head or upoko of Ngāi Tuahuriri, which is the people with traditional authority over where the city of Christchurch is based. And as that's part of years and years of work in trying to create what they've been calling a bicultural model of learning and teaching and research, where mana whenua partners are included in decision making, even if they are a minority group in terms of numbers, because they are the traditional owners of the land and have mana over the whenua or the land in which we sit. But one of the consequences of that has been a stretch for mana whenua and other Māori researchers in the university and teachers being asked to do a lot of work, coming into a lot of different people's classrooms, commenting on people's teaching, helping people include Māori values such as kaitiakitanga in their teaching. And then there's been a big move in the university to try and upskill lecturers and students and others to connect with the values and principles of mana whenua pedagogies and of mana whenua values of relating to the land, and kind of give people a sense of permission to engage with that in a respectful way, and not have to, like, it's great to obviously invite Māori lecturers into the classroom, but to also take some ownership of the process of reconnecting. So one of the things I really liked about Amber's proposal to do this class and the way that she's done it is that it kind of invites both Māori and Pākehā and other treaty settler students to kind of join in a space together where they can both learn from the land in which we are all situated in a way that is generous towards Māori student needs, who may or may not be in the classroom, but also is inviting us all to learn in that space. So I really wanted to invite Amber in to do this work, because her postdoc is a 2-year postdoc looking at decolonising pedagogies, and particularly for Pākehā settlers. And this is kind of a bit of an experiment, and it's just been so great to see the outcomes and to hear from the students, because I got to spend some time in the classroom too, how much they've enjoyed that. Yeah, so thank you, Amber, and just wanted to provide some of that context for others.
Thank you. I think, Benny, you might have your hand up, and I'm just conscious, Jennifer and Heather, we haven't had an opportunity to ask you yet whether you'd like to input into the discussion. So feel free to jump in if you'd like to. And while you're thinking, we'll just hear from you, Benny.
Yeah, look, just on the back of Kelly's comment there, I completely agree. And it was something that struck me when Amber was talking as well, just about how effective this is to bring different ways of knowing together. And again, what should have come through from one of Spilly's presentation is this idea that we believe that our ways have utility and value for the modern world. And it comes very clearly from our grandfather, you know, that if we don't share our knowledge, then our knowledge is lost. It's useless if we don't share it. So we have to navigate this space of what is exclusively Indigenous knowledge and only for certain people. There is knowledge that is like that. And how do we adapt it so that we have these really valuable systems of knowledge that are open for everyone? And for us, from Amber's presentation, what sort of resonated with me between these two is that connecting the country, connecting to our earthkin, developing a sense of responsibility and obligation to the place. That's the response. It's an Indigenous ethic by all means, but it's not solely an Indigenous ethic or exclusively an Indigenous ethic. And so sort of programs like the one that Amber discusses and she's put together, I think are really the way that we need to move forward and to get through these really complex conversations of cultural appropriation or, you know, cultural degradation. So just wanted to add that in support of your comment there, Kelly.
Would you like to respond at all, or
yeah,
Kelly, or?
Thanks, Kelly. That was really good context for how this came about here. Ben, absolutely, the whole point, and over the next 2 years of what I'm going to be trying to do is get more of these experiments going that do strip out that specificity and really look at the principles that we are being called to draw upon here, because I think you're absolutely right. This is like a coming together of two different that have been very distinct ways of doing things, but actually finding a synthesis. So as you were presenting earlier, you were talking about, okay, there's some good things that are in a student-led and various other kinds of what we might call problematically westernized ways of doing things. And what keeps coming out from the sources and elders that I've been directed to is that it is not a one way or the other solution. We actually have to get that balance of what are the dysfunctional aspects of westernized ways of doing things, strip them out. What are the sustainable, bad word, ways of doing things from Indigenous and traditional communities, and put those things together, because there are benefits that have come through the last 500 years of a whole swathe of people being really disconnected that has led us to technologies we could repurpose and all sorts of other great things if we can strip the colonizing ethic out of them. So just wanting to sound out that it's really, it actually feels like we're getting some traction on that, especially here today, and of being able to sort of bring those things together in a way that's actually might work. So thanks very much for the feedback and comments there. Back to you, Anne.
This is a rather half-baked thought, but it reminds me of conversation that I've had with Ben and David to some extent, but there's this huge tension for me between, you know, I guess foregrounding the problematic aspects of colonization and of Western knowledge systems and the economic systems that have been so prevalent. And then on the flip side, it's what Anka was talking about, which is presenting a hopeful way forward. And there's this tension for me internally between raising the things that are problematic, you know, that I, for example, am a product of my whole Western kind of colonial past, you know, and I can see myself grappling with that recognition that we must return to, you know, First Nations, Indigenous perspectives, that we are in terms of Western knowledge systems on a particular unsustainable path for our planet. And we've got to kind of reverse that and undo that Western centric kind of discourse. But Anka was talking about students that she teaches in international development. And Christoph, I think this relates back a little bit to the context in India. And so when we think in post-development context and we think in kind of the confronting aspects of many people in the world being quite marginalized and economic systems failing them, Anka talks about needing to give those students a hopeful politics, needing to give them a hopeful path forward in their work. So when she's teaching them international development, and I think has a background in anthropology at university, she's kind of trying to find a way to not shy away from talking about all the ways in which Western systems have failed us, Western education systems have failed us, but to offer a hope for the way forward and to be looking forward. And so I guess I just wondered if any of you wanted to reflect on that tension that you might see in your own work between bringing to visibility the problems and the damage that's been done with some of our, knowledge systems and Western ways of doing things, and then also trying to create a way forward, a hopeful way forward, and whether you see yourself doing that in your work, repairing, kind of creating a hopeful sort of politics, if you like, for people and for students. Does anyone have any reflections on that?
I mean, I feel, sorry, can I go or anyone else? Okay. No, I mean, I feel we, especially in India, we have that tension very strongly, because that belief in the system that if you finish school and you get a degree and you go to college and then your life is sorted is very much there, despite all the evidence that we see that this is actually not the case, and probably never was, but certainly now it is not the case. But that people still very much hold on to that belief that what I need is basically a certificate, a degree, and then my life is sorted. That is still there, and that is something I think which we are struggling with, because we don't give grades, we don't give certificates, and so on. And we sometimes even hear that from our learners who are in our learning centers. They do their projects, and so we are trying to make this basically based on a portfolio that we document everything that they do, or they document it themselves rather. And obviously they have their concrete projects to show, but still very often we hear those things like, so how do I prove that I have done this? Where's my certificate to show that I have obtained those skills, and so on. So that is still there, but I also feel there is more and more consciousness that okay, if I really get some hands-on skills that are relevant to my own life, then I can make something out of it. And I think we do see in the communities where we are working, we do slowly see a change, that people are more aware of that people take our learning center more serious after a year or two, when they see, okay, actually these solutions can come out from there. Actually, learners have acquired these and those skills, but it's a very long process, I think, to get there. And especially at the beginning, whenever we start a new learning center, there's really a lot of skepticism in the local community, which we need to overcome.
Thank you.
Going to add. Oh, sorry, Anne.
No, you go. Yeah.
All I was going to add was, for me, Indigenous ways of knowing and being are hopeful by nature, in that they're positioned to allow a living world to thrive and continue through that central ethic of knowing, understanding, and caring place. But the thing to keep in mind is that this way of being hasn't been destroyed. It's still here, and it's been marginalized, certainly. But for me and Spilly, and we, Spilly was the first fellow who talked to me about this. It's about a process of remembering, and I suppose remembering is a hopeful act itself. Remembering who we are, remembering that we aren't separated from our earth kin, that we are all one. Once we remember that, and this idea of a sentient earth, I think in Amber's presentation, I find it difficult not to be hopeful when we sort of apply that kind of thinking. And I suppose in a meta way, I'm hopeful because that way of being and that way of understanding the world has never been destroyed. It's just been marginalized. But we wouldn't all be sitting in this room if there wasn't a way to sort of continue this sort of thing. So that's probably my reflection.
And might I just extend onto that from one of your country women, Amber, April Parrota, who was read a lot of her work and research in her early days with the Stronger Smarter Institute. And we used to hang on to the phrase that's attributed to her of all the challenges we face in the world, our ancestors have faced and overcome in the past. We just have to remember. Rudolf Steiner said all learning is remembering. And I think he meant that we have the wisdom already in the, thinking Jungian, the collective subconscious or the collective consciousness. We have the wisdom already to face all the challenges to address all the challenges that we are facing. We don't need more technology or innovation. It's already been done. We just have to remember. And it takes me back, and I can't remember the details, but a part of the challenge for us, of course, is our work's in the ACT and yours is in Christchurch, which are relatively small cities with a lot of natural environment around the place. If we talk about LA or Bangalore or places like that, it becomes even Sydney a more difficult probably prospect. But I remember the two gentlemen, I can't remember their names unfortunately, who took permaculture to Havana when Cuba was in a huge economic crisis, and the success that they had with that in the inner suburbs in Havana. Sorry, I went longer than I thought I was going to.
That's okay. And yes, we could talk about the organoponicos in Cuba another time, because that's something that I'm very interested in too. I think it didn't help them that they got cut off by the US in terms of trading. So they had to turn inwards, find ways to survive. Jennifer has put a very rich reflection in the chat space. Sorry, what was that?
Which is probably part of the solution, turning inwards, focusing on local economies or less global economies.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. So thank you, Jennifer, for posting your reflection there. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to comment on what you've said there. Basically, there's a kind of, I'm just reading, the thing I'm snagging on is the value / economic proposition of the degree itself. Yes, I think that's it. I guess it feeds into the neoliberal machine of higher education. And the pressure we're all under, of course, to have fee-paying students and increase our fee-paying students. And is there any thinking activism in CERN around student fees in this space, or are there differences between Australia and Oratoria in terms of the cost of degrees? I wonder whether anyone wants to comment on that. And I'm also conscious that prior we are going to have a look at what Community Economies Research Network teaching resources we have in this last part of the session. Does anyone want to make a comment or reflection in response to Jennifer's? Catherine, thanks.
I could just, yes, I completely feel that awful dilemma. And, it's one of those, a public forum, how much do you say? Yeah, I agree. And I often feel really deeply conflicted and uncomfortable when I'm attending an open day and have to sell a degree program to a student. Yeah, that's something that does not sit well with me. In terms of what's happening in the community economies space around us, so we just very recently created a formal legal entity, the Community Economies Institute, that's sort of drawing on the group of people that are working in this space. And we're very young, and we're all working on a volunteer basis. So it's little steps, but one of the things that we're really passionate about doing is thinking about what we can provide in this space of teaching and learning around community economies. How might we be able to kind of, in my vision anyway, to enact some of what universities ought to be doing? You know, we ought to be about learning and teaching and research about things that matter. It ought to be about delivering around a social justice agenda, not a profit-making agenda. You know, so it's not something we're in a position to do yet, but it's definitely something we're working towards and talking about. Yeah.
And I think part of the motivation for this session is exactly that kind of trying to think more creatively about how the Community Economies Research Network and the Community Economies Institute might better support those of us who work in universities, or how there might be more cross-pollination in teaching and learning in grassroots locations with more formal educational organisations. So I'm very grateful to you, Priya, for actually going through our Community Economies website and looking at what resources we have there to date. So in this very last part of the session, I'm going to throw to you and ask you if you'd like to share a little bit about what you've been collating and putting together.
Yep. Thank you, Anne, and good morning again from Bangkok. Thank you, Anne and Krista, for co-organizing this very stimulating session, and also thank you to all our speakers for sharing their very informative and thoughtful presentations. So the Community Economies Institute has compiled various teaching and learning resources, and they can be easily accessed by the public through the Community Economies website, https://communityeconomies.org. And I'd like to recognize the amount of work put by Jenny Cameron, Catherine Gibson, and Lindsay Jackson to manage this website. So on the main page and under the resources menu, you will be able to see the submenus linking to the Diverse Economies Iceberg image, community resources, teaching materials, and multimedia archive. The page for the iceberg image of Diverse Economies contains translated versions of the diagram into French, Danish, Spanish, and Italian. It also includes a floating coconut image representing the diversity of gendered economic activities and practices in Melanesia, as you can see from this slide. And under the submenu community resources, you will encounter links to a few resources used for community engagements and workshops, including the Shifting Focus Resource Kit and the link to the community partnering website. So this, the latter in itself contains many tools for action-oriented partnerships with different actors from academia and development practice world. It also provides many interesting materials for asset-based community development and diverse economies framing. And the third resources submenu opens to the teaching resource page, which will bring you the links to some materials for teaching Take Back the Economy, which was shared with us earlier through the chat by Jenny Cameron, and a lesson plan for teaching undergraduate students diverse economies and action research, to name a few. The Take Back the Economy site can also be accessed from a link from the main page of the CE website. So this is on the landing, and on the right-hand side, you will see the direct link to the Take Back the Economy webpage. The Take Back the Economy webpage has a section on use in undergraduate teaching, which you can see at the bottom part of the page. So as you can see here, you can navigate and explore for more helpful resources linking to those other materials. You'll also find a full set of course materials from when Jenny Cameron taught the course, Take Back the Economy, in Hong Kong. And there are many lectures and other kinds of activities that are that Jenny used during her teaching in Hong Kong. And lastly, there is the submenu for multimedia resources, which provides the link to the different video categories, including interviews before and after 2015, lectures before and after 2015, documentaries, conversation, recordings from past Liviana conference, and teaching videos. So these multimedia resources can also be directly accessed from the YouTube channel of the Community Economies Institute. And currently there are 10 videos in the teaching video playlist, including short clips that Kelly Dombrowski uses in teaching community economies at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. For easy reference and circulation, I created a list in Google Sheet, which you can access using the shortened link bit.ly/CE teaching materials. So if you have additional materials that you would like to be included in this online library, I'd appreciate that you could send me the following details, like how I've organized them here: creator and contributor, the publish date, the title of the teaching material, the type of teaching material, so that we easily know what kinds of the typology of materials that we have, and the storage location or link where the material can be downloaded, so that when you're looking at the Google Sheet, you can easily just access them through the links provided here. So thank you very much, and I look forward to growing our online library with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya, for giving everyone almost a little bit of a roadmap or a walk through all those different resources that we can access for free, for free. They're all there as a kind of creative commons, so that's wonderful. I wonder whether anyone would like to say any more about that, particularly those of you who've been involved in Jenny, would you like to say anything else? You've certainly been involved in generating a lot of those materials, but really at this point, it would be wonderful to think about ways forward, how we might build on this session, how we might share further resources, how we might forge some connections between the places where we do our work of different kinds and the Community Economies Research Network and Institute. So any thoughts?
So one of the things I just wrote in the chat for Priya is that we can put things like the online inventory on the CE website. And in that teaching section, we can put resources and so on that people are happy to be shared, so that, that is a section for resources for sharing with other people. Wonderful. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks so much for all the work you do to keep that space active and up to date. It's a huge job. Thank you. Benny.
I'm just wondering, what about getting people to come out and be guest speakers or run workshops with us through the Centre for Sustainable Communities, even through the Faculty of Education? I see that as a way of keeping this community, like forming a community of practice that branches international rather than just the local stuff. Is that something that we could explore?
I think that's a great idea. And certainly we've got this sort of need to sit down and do some planning for next year, but maybe a series of events that could pull some of these strands together and give a chance to keep this conversation going would be really good. Yeah.
One thing that's really stood out for me with this is, Ben, I like the idea of the speakers and the knowledge sharing. An Indigenous geographer named Michelle Daigle, based at the University of Toronto, wrote a really great piece a few years ago called The Spectacle of Reconciliation. And just the fast and furious way decoloniality and reconciliation has moved through a lot of universities here in this context. And there's not a lot of material, like actual examples. It's kind of, the Indigenous geographers, I know there's a critique in a way of kind of Indigenous washing that's happening, but at the same time, there's also like the university I've just started working for, there's an Indigenous-led teaching and research plan that all our curriculum now goes through that, and we have like elders and knowledge holders vet and go through and work with us to develop the teaching resources. But I think these are such good grounded examples, and to make these connections and to really share them, and like if there's a way to share, and because there's this kind of a trend of the words, but then there's also the real material awesome practice like this that are very humble and grassroots and local. And I think having more discussion about that, because it's I'm watching how it's played out in different jobs. But the job I have now, I think a lot of my colleagues would really love to learn more about, and then how do we do this in our teaching practice? So I second on Ben and sharing these resources of grounded decoloniality and really facing these troubles. And it ties in with Jennifer's saying too, the larger, like one of the universities I work for here gets a whole bunch of money from pipelines. So on one hand, we're talking about place-based learning, and then they're building a pipeline under the river. So that's the bigger context. But then, yeah, so grappling with these difficulties, but and then knowledge sharing with so many great thinkers and makers and workers. And I just want to say, I love the drawing of that lizard thinking from the tail. And it's very somatic, getting into the gut and getting into the legs and into the body, and not up here freaking out. But it was I love that image. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Throw something in, Ian?
Yes, and then Jennifer. Yes, sure.
Sorry, apologies.
No, that's okay.
The Gugar is very much about thinking back, going back to the wisdom that's sitting in over 2,000 generations here. And we're not just talking about human generations. We're talking about, when we say ancestors, we're not just talking about humans. We're talking often about our earthkin. And I mean, all the wisdom we need to move forward, we can get through looking back and reinterpreting it into a contemporary kind of frame, as the 6 L's is exactly what that is. Like, it's an example of cultural continuity. And there are many examples like that that we've been able to tap into. Thank you guys, because this stuff's just kind of starting to really settle with me, just listening to the conversation and thinking about it now. So I don't know whether we can legally share publications on the CE website, but one of our great colleagues, Phil Roberts, has just edited a book that's got a fantastic chapter in it. There's a really strong critique of reconciliation in Australia and how it has kind of seeped into the education fraternity through the Australian curriculum. And in a way that Benny just gave a very brief critique of before, but it'd be great if we could share some really kind of critical pieces like that. I don't know whether we can do that, can we?
So that's something to think more about, as something moving forward. How might we do that more? Find ways to share, whether it's through the community economies links or other ways. Jennifer, I would love to bring you in at this point, and just bearing in mind, everyone, that we are due to finish in a couple of minutes. So if anyone has any burning last thoughts, we'll hear from Jennifer first and then from you.
Oh, thanks. I just thought I'd speak rather than being silent right at the end. But I would love to be kept in some sort of loop. The project that Nikki and I have sort of started to initiate up here, we're doing it on our research time, but it's a pedagogical project. And so having a space to think through all of the, I guess, like logistical and economic aspects of what it would take to integrate that into one of our degree programs versus, running it as like a community facing grassroots project like that. I mean, this is what this was about, but yeah, just really working through those ideas in a community would be wonderful. So yeah, thanks for today, and for, please put me on any lists.
For sure. Thank you. And yes, we very much hope we can continue this conversation into, it feels like we're at the end of 2021, even though it's November. So I'm starting to say to be continued in 2022. Anyone got any last thoughts they want to share, or last words?
Thank you. Just thank you to everyone. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's been a really wonderful session. Thank you everyone for your contributions, and thanks Anne so much for making this happen. It's been wonderful.
Pleasure. It feels actually, going back to your beautiful drawings, Billy, that there's a sense that some moments allow us to connect a little bit the head and the heart, and to feel a little bit more like, you know, there's kind of a soul or a deep grassroots life in what we're doing in our day jobs, if you like. For some of us, it can feel like we need those moments where we get grounded and connected back to the grassroots. So this session has very much been that for me. So I just want to say a huge thank you to you all for contributing. It's been wonderful. And watch this space to be continued, either by email list or by the CERN kind of network. We'll certainly be in touch, and please do get in touch with me if you're concerned, say, Jennifer, that I won't have your details. Maybe you can send me an email, just refresh my memory as to what you and Nikki are doing. Is there any other suggestion from you, Catherine, as to how we might facilitate an ongoing, make sure we've got everyone? I think we got a list of who was attending. Is that right?
We've got a list and emails of everyone who registered to come along.
Okay.
So yeah, great. We can be in touch through that. So thank you very much, everyone, and wishing you well, and thanks for being part of the session. Yeah, great session. Thank you very much to everyone who took the time to be here and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.